Good evening and welcome to the Editor's Table. My name is Alet Law, and tonight we are going back 16 years in time to one of the most vexing murders and sensational trials to grip the country. I am, of course, talking about the murder of Inge Lotz, a brilliant, beautiful young woman who had a whole life ahead of her. Her then boyfriend, Fred van der Vyver, was accused of her murder and, following a contentious trial, acquitted. A special welcome to our News 24 subscribers who are joining in on the conversation and without whose support, journalism like the podcast we are discussing tonight would not be possible. Please remember to post your questions and comments in the Q&A box, and we will try to answer as many of them as possible. Joining me are the producers of News 24's new podcast series called The Inge Lotz Story, A Miscarriage of Justice. Catherine Rice is our ace podcast producer at News 24, and Matthew Brown is an independent producer and journalist with whom we partnered for this production. And I'll let you tell us a little bit more about how you became involved in this story in just a while, Matthew. But first, Catherine, to both of you, congratulations on the podcast and for telling the story in such a compelling way and for highlighting ultimately, as the title suggests, the failure of our justice system to bring to book a killer. Catherine, I want to start with you. You've worked on this story for 9 months, if not longer, and you can tell us how long it took. After all these years, what is it about this case that people still today cannot let go of and continue to be fascinated by?
Well, Alet, I think Inge Lotz was such a beautiful young woman. She was both brilliant and beautiful, as you said in your introduction. And she was a University of Stellenbosch student. She seemed to have the perfect life. She was just 22. She had come in the top 5 in matric in the Western Cape. She really was excelling in every area of her life. She had friends. She was warm. She had an infectious laugh. People warmed her. They liked her. And then she was brutally murdered, and her life was cut short. But I think what shocked and fascinated the public was the excessive violence that was rained down on this beautiful woman in her own apartment. The circumstances around it, who could have been the killer? It must have been someone close to her. And of course, it sparked and triggered so many theories right from the beginning. Everybody had an opinion about who could have done it. Immediately, as you know, the police believed it was somebody close to her because it was such an excessively violent killing. And so, of course, everybody in the public just wanted to know more and wanted to know how this could have happened. How did these people get into her apartment? How was it possible that a young woman living in a security complex could have been bludgeoned and stabbed to death in such a brutal way? And then, of course, as the months unfolded and the story unfolded, people just couldn't get enough of each and every development in that case.
Yeah, I mean, in some way it was the perfect story in that it had, as you said, the violence, it had this beautiful young woman, it had the story of a lover, a boyfriend that could potentially be the murderer. It was almost the classic whodunit in a sense. And of course, as we all know now, Fred was ultimately acquitted, and the state's case against him was hugely flawed. And we'll get into all the details of that in a minute. But the overwhelming theme of the story for me really is the miscarriage of justice, not only against Fred, but really against, Inge and her parents, who after all these years have not seen justice done for their daughter's killers.
Well, I think absolutely. I think, the fascination around this case was also because Fred was this handsome young man who was also excelling in life. They seemed to be the perfect couple. They were beautiful. They were going to get married. They exchanged letters. They exchanged text messages all the time. It was this beautiful young romance. And so when he was arrested several months after Inge's murder, the public perception was he really was convicted in the court of public opinion. People were very quick to say, well, it must have been him, and obviously it's him, and it's a sort of no-brainer. This is this is how these stories play out in South Africa. It so often is, unfortunately, the person closest to the victim. So in terms of miscarriage of justice, I think from the, you know, for Inge's family, there will never be justice. They can't bring her back, and you know, that they can't turn back the clock, but they also haven't had the sense of closure that I think many families get when a perpetrator is arrested and put behind bars. For Fred, obviously, the miscarriage of justice was that he spent many years of his life defending his name and his reputation, and although he was ultimately acquitted, there in some quarters remains a pall of suspicion that hangs over him. There's certainly doubts in some people's minds. You know, there's a man who got away with it because he had the money for the best lawyers in the country. Yeah.
Matthew, your interest in this case goes way back as well. Tell us a little bit about how you started researching the story and how your interest was initially piqued.
It started over a decade ago, actually, and I started by reading Anthony Altbecker's very good book, The Fruit of a Poisoned Tree. And the case was very intriguing and the book was very well written, but I thought, wow, this would make a very interesting documentary or podcast or film or series. And I thought here was a case where the accusation is that police framed someone for murder. And I thought that's got to be a 1 in a million story. It sounds ridiculous, to be honest. And so that's why I started interviewing people and researching the case. And as I went along, I kind of discovered that actually my initial thought was a bit naive, that it's not necessarily just a 1 in a million case where there are accusations that police have fabricated evidence. And that just kind of drew me in, really, for the last 10 years.
I want to talk a little bit about the police's theory that Inge's killer had to have been someone close to her that she knew.
Yes.
This is not a new idea or concept. We've seen countless cases of murder and violence against women where the partner or the spouse ends up being the murderer. So that Fred was the first person the police looked at was in and of itself not strange. But there were also a number of specific things in this case that made them suspect Fred, Matthew.
Yes. So police all over the world are taught to keep it simple. If you think the boyfriend did it, the boyfriend probably did it. And 9 times out of 10, you're right. And so they looked at Fred straight away, and they then discovered 3 really big pieces of evidence. The first was that the pathologist thought that the police should look for a hammer. And in Fred's car, they found an ornamental hammer that was given to him for Christmas by Inge's parents. And the wounds seemed to match the hammer. The second piece of evidence was that on the floor in Inge's bathroom, there was a mark in blood. And when police examined the mark and they examined Fred's squash shoe, they came to the conclusion that Fred's shoe had actually made that mark. So Fred's shoe was in that bathroom and had blood on it. The third piece of evidence was that Inge had rented a DVD just an hour or so before her murder, and they found Fred's fingerprints on that rented DVD. And Fred was in and out of the apartment quite often, so that rented DVD should have been the only thing in the apartment that would not have his fingerprints on it. So they really had these 3 pieces of evidence that looked really watertight. When you hear those 3 pieces of evidence, you think, what is the fuss about? Obviously, he did it.
Yeah, and then there was also that letter that Inge wrote the day or the night before, indicating that she and Fred had had a fight of some sorts. and which the police then claimed was motive for the murder.
Yes, they had a quarrel, and there was a letter that Inge gave Fred that morning on campus, and she apologized for a range of things. And when the police looked at that letter, they thought really they have motive. I think as it came out in court, it turned out really that they wrote letters to each other frequently, and the letter was kind of like a normal apology about a fight they'd had, and it kind of, the air was taken out of its sails, really.
Yeah, so you mentioned the hammer, the bloody footprint, and the DVD with the fingerprint on, and all together, these things are pretty compelling. If you are, if you are looking at a murder, you have someone, a suspect, and it's the boyfriend, but then eventually the defense picked all of this apart and found that all of this evidence in some way had a flaw in it, right?
Yes. What was interesting for me is that Fred only had one defense, which was that he didn't do it. He didn't say, I was in the apartment, but she was dead, or but my fingerprints. All he said was, I was at work at the Old Mutual and I didn't do it, and I have no idea what you're talking about. Which is quite unusual when there's such strong evidence. And so his family sold their farm and raised as much money as they could, and they started to look at experts, both in South Africa and abroad, because there was this dispute over the evidence, and not everybody in the South African police thought that these three pieces of evidence were as strong as the investigating officers did. And maybe I should talk a little bit first about the fingerprint, because to me in the beginning that seemed like the most clear piece of evidence. When Fred's family contacted Pat Wertheim, who is an American fingerprint expert, who interestingly found that a Jackson Pollock painting purportedly worth $100 million was a fraud. He was one of the fingerprint experts who actually found that it was a fraud. So they asked him about this fingerprint on the DVD, and he took one look at it and said, it doesn't look like it came off a DVD at all. It looks like it came off a drinking glass. But there's an easy way to tell. All we have to do is ask the police for the actual DVD. And when we look at it, we'll see Fred's fingerprint on it, and we'll know if it's true or not. And the cops said, well, actually, we gave it back to the rental company, even though, it's a R5 piece of plastic. And that's really where the fight over the fingerprint started, where the defense was going, you say it came off of the DVD, it doesn't look like it, but you don't have the actual thing it came off, and you're saying, we just have to trust you. And that's where the case started to unravel for the prosecution.
But that is just baffling to me. I don't know about you, but that they would give back the DVD cover, and I don't want to give too much away from the podcast, because I think people should listen to it, because it's just simply fascinating. But that they would give back the DVD cover, in a sense, played it into the defense's hands, obviously, but also then because they argued that, initially, since the print did not come from the DVD cover at all, that they initially did not think it was a significant piece of evidence, so they just returned it to the DVD store, which is in any case to me strange that they would return it. But if they work from that assumption, then that obviously makes sense.
Yes, you're supposed to keep evidence that you take fingerprints off for that exact reason. and you're supposed to take photographs of that evidence. But there were no photographs taken of the DVD cover. Or if you speak to some people, they say they were photographs, but they were destroyed. It depends who you believe. In my opinion, either there was initially a mistake, that they took a fingerprint off of a drinking glass and mislabeled it as having come off of a DVD, and then later felt that they couldn't go back and say they'd made a mistake. So in a bit of desperation, they got rid of the DVD cover so that no one could be blamed. That's one way of thinking of it. And the other way is to say, well, they knew that they were taking a fingerprint off of the drinking glass and they got rid of the DVD cover to cover their tracks. And that might have flown in a normal South African court, but when you bring in the World Authority on Fingerprints, he's just going to blow your evidence away.
Right. Catherine, I remember this case sort of in the back of my mind. It's one of the first cases where the police's evidence gathering and the police's handling of the crime scene and the case overall really came under the spotlight. And I remember years later writing about the Henry van Breda case, which was also, as you know, in that Stellenbosch area, and the police saying, that they don't want a repeat of the Inge Lotz case. So they are putting their most senior, their best detectives on this case and throwing everything they have at it. Is this a problem that the police, don't know how to deal with crime scenes anymore?
I think, yes, I think it is a huge problem that South Africa is facing. I think that experienced forensic scientists, I think experienced police officers, experienced fingerprint examiners are hard to come by. And I think it's not difficult to mess up a crime scene. I mean, there was a case, there've been many examples of cases where police have destroyed evidence themselves. In this particular case, they should have taken many more fingerprints than what they did. They only had 11 fingerprints and a 12th fingerprint that went missing, apparently. So there were a lot of flaws right from the very beginning, right from the moment they set foot into that apartment. And in the court cases that I've covered over the years, you see it time and again. You see where a case can really just fall to pieces because somebody simply hasn't done their job properly. And it's incredibly frustrating for the families, and DNA evidence that just is, the backlogs are unbelievable. When Matt and I were working on this story, some of those figures came out in March this year. Unbelievable numbers that we're talking of backlogs in the forensic laboratories in South Africa. So we have a major, major problem facing our justice system. There's no question of it. And I think since the Inge Lotz case, I think things have deteriorated significantly. And I think you'll find there are many cases that are not in the public domain that the public hasn't latched onto and been fascinated by, that go under the radar, and those families sit there wondering if their child's murder will ever be found because the police just aren't even bothering to contact them. And those stories are really common. And I speaking to some of the experts in the story that Matt spoke to, and some of the experts that I've spoken to, who have worked in the system, say many of the people unleashed in these laboratories do not have the qualifications to do what they're doing. And I think Matt's, in one of Matt's video clips, you can really see that in the way the hammer tests were conducted. So, that is an absolute example of incompetence and somebody who just shouldn't actually be conducting that test in the first place. So yes, I think South Africa is facing a huge problem in terms of the justice system and the qualifications of the people running these investigations.
So we have a few reader questions around this. Thank you for that. Lee Jarvis, why didn't Fred sue the police? Fred didn't in fact, take legal action. And initially, the High Court said that there was a case of malicious prosecution, and then the verdict was eventually turned over in the Supreme Court of Appeal. Matthew, can you tell us a little bit about that? I know that was also a long process, and I think a lot of people feel that Fred was really done in there with the Supreme Court of Appeal overturning that that ruling.
Yeah, thank you. So initially he sued the Minister of Police for malicious prosecution, and he was awarded something like 48 million rand. And the Cape High Court agreed that police had acted maliciously and destroyed his life. And the police asked to appeal, and they went up in front of the Supreme Court of Appeal, whose decision, in my mind and in other people's minds, was very strange. They didn't say that there wasn't a malicious action by the police. In fact, they said that Fred's lawyers had proven that some police did act maliciously and had committed perjury, but that the state prosecutors, because they knew that some of the police were lying, they must have had other reasons for pursuing the case. So it was really a very strange technical reason that they overturned the award money to Fred, and really to add insult to injury, the policemen who were accused of committing perjury had since left the force, and they were paid very high fees to testify in the civil trial. And when Fred lost in the Supreme Court of Appeal, he actually has to pay the state's expenses. And part of the state's expenses are the fees that the state paid to the policeman who lied about the case.
It's just incredible. I think the most alarming part for me about this whole case is that had Fred been unable to pay for all the international experts and for his legal team to fight the police's case against him, he would have probably been convicted and sent to prison. And there has to be more people in the same situation that can't afford that type of legal defense. Do you think this is something that is a problem that we are not that aware of? And how often does this happen, Matthew?
It's hard to tell how often it happens. But as Fred says in his interview, the fact that he came so close to being found guilty in this case until the international experts came to testify on his behalf must lead you to believe that someone without the financial backing that he had, it would have been a much faster and more brutal case, which is really interesting. And that's what led me to kind of change my mind from my original position that this must be a 1 in a million case, to start to believe that actually this kind of thing happens more often than we think it does. And the reasons are very, very interesting. It seems like, and this, I was talking to Pat Wertheim, who is the American fingerprint expert, who gave a really good interview on this. And he said, it starts off really simply. Police see that people they arrest often get off. They know that they're guilty of a crime, but they don't go to prison for whatever reason. There's not enough evidence, or they have good lawyers. And so if you were to massage some evidence and tweak things here and there, then you might get a guilty verdict. And you're just framing the guilty. You know that this suspect is guilty. So in fact, maybe you think of yourself as a bit of a hero. you're taking down the bad guys by just fabricating a little bit of evidence. And the problem is that sometimes they get the wrong guy.
Right. So in this case, I don't know, it feels to me like a little bit of a combination of that and incompetence. Could I draw you on that?
Yes, there's certainly a lot of incompetence in this case. You know, when the first investigating officer arrived on the scene, there were lots of policemen in the flat walking around through the blood, which is a disaster. They didn't canvass the area. Police Crime Scene 101 says you start knocking on doors and you ask the neighbors, did you hear anything? Did you see anything? They didn't do that. In fact, there was a terrible part, embarrassing part of this case is that two detectives saw after the crime, they were looking through the crime scene, private investigators working for Inge Lotz's family, and they saw that there was used food wrappers in the bin. And they thought, oh, that's interesting, that should be fingerprinted. And those boxes and wrappers were fingerprinted, and it turned out to be the fingerprint of the policeman who was supposed to be looking after the flat at night. And he had gone and gotten takeaways and thrown it in the bin. So it was just terribly handled from the moment, the get-go.
And I think the forensic expert, David Klasov, who you also interviewed in this podcast, Catherine, said it's one of the worst police investigations ever to take place in South Africa, and one of the worst forensic investigations he's seen.
Absolutely. He's testified in a lot of cases in South Africa. He's a very well-known forensic scientist who is very well respected, and I think his opinion is quite worrying for the future of South Africa and the future of our justice system. He really believes that within a matter of several years, our forensic laboratories are not going to be functioning. And he says things are already in a dire state. In this particular case, I think, he just said that the levels of incompetence, the perjury that was committed, there were so many factors to make him come to that conclusion that this was one of the worst cases he's ever witnessed. But I'm sure it won't be the last, and that's very worrying. That these kind of mistakes can happen, and to that extent, and that the people involved and the people who were involved in really impacting on the life of Fred van der Vyver, whose life will never really be the same again. Not one of those people has been charged, and for me, I think that's profoundly disturbing.
So, just to go back to the case itself, at the end of the day, this remains an unsolved case, right? And if Fred didn't kill Inge, someone else killed her. And I think the thing that fascinates a lot of people still is that with Fred, you could still imagine a motive. They knew each other personally. They could have, had troubles or whatever in their relationship. But if it was someone else, what could have been the motive? And, what could have driven someone to commit such a brutal and excessively violent crime, Catherine?
I think, David Klatzer actually says in the interview that Matt did with him, he says, it was either a sort of crime of passion or somebody close who had, an axe to grind with this person because they're close to them, or it could have been a drug-fueled frenzy. So, he was saying, not one but two murder weapons were used to kill Inge. And in most cases, a murderer will only use one murder weapon. Yet in this case, it was such excessive violence that, often that is a sign of somebody close to the person who's very angry, who's driven by rage. But it could also be drug-fueled. Many violent crimes that we see in this country are there's alcohol involved, or there's tic involved, or there's a substance that causes a huge amount of aggression. So there are alternative possibilities. This could have been committed by a stranger to Inge, and that possibility exists, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that is the thing that is always interesting to me, is because, of course, there's a norm for these kinds of murders, and experts who deal with it regularly know that when they see certain things on a crime scene, then that means or suggests certain things, but that doesn't mean it's the rule, and that is in fact what happened, and even experts around the world in various fields disagree with each other in this case on the evidence. And we're kind of brought up to believe that evidence and CSI is absolute, but it isn't. And this case just, proves it. There are so many different opinions and views, and the experts are arguing against each other based on the same evidence, Matthew.
Yeah, and I think there's a very popular project in America called the Innocence Project, which looks at new ways of looking at evidence to see if people in jail who swear they're innocent actually might be. And a lot of these people are convicted on evidence. A lot of these people are convicted on eyewitness testimony, which is known to be flawed. And of course, if we didn't have this problem, then you wouldn't have the need for the Innocence Project to find people who are actually in jail who are innocent. And this kind of CSI forensic evidence process that is only really 10 to 15 years old. 20 years ago, the way of investigating crimes didn't look like this. It's amazing and it works really well, but you have to know how to do it and you have to follow the protocols. If you lose chain of custody of an object like they did with the DVD cover, then it's not going to help you. You really have to follow the rules. And what's interesting is at some point you have to trust the policemen who are doing this job. And you have to trust the crime lab. And one of the issues in this country is that the crime lab is run by the state, and the police investigating officers are very close to the people who are in the crime lab. Sometimes they're the same people. So there isn't that distance. You don't feel like the crime lab is a third party the way you do in some American states. So there's a gray area, and that can lead to things not being quite as clear-cut as you think they should be.
So I guess the obvious question is, where to now with this case? So many avenues have been explored. Both Inge's parents and Fred's defense have had external experts conduct investigations. And it really seems that we're at a bit of a dead end, and then that there will never be answers. Does the police have an ongoing investigation? Do they have any other suspects? Have they ever considered any other suspects? Matthew?
Well, actually, there was a young man who was implicated in this crime just a few weeks after the murder of Inge. And he did a pointing out with the police at the apartment on camera. They filmed him. And he said that he was in the apartment with some friends, and he was high on tick, and Inge had been killed by one of his friends. And he signed a statement in front of a magistrate in Springbok to that effect. Unfortunately, every time he told the story, it changed. So he had no credibility. And he was a career housebreaker, which might lead you to think that maybe he had broken into Inge's flat. But at the same time, how do you know what he's saying is true or not true? He seemed to know things about the crime that he couldn't have. But then he also tried to blame all of his friends. So it's really, really hard to tell what were lies and what were truths. But he wasn't really investigated properly. The police saw him as a distraction. They thought that they had their man. They had Fred. They'd already arrested Fred and found his fingerprint on the DVD cover. And so they wanted this man, Werner, to go away, essentially. But the very strange thing is in 2008, he was tracked down by a cop called Piet Viljoen, who was investigating this case. And this man, Werner, said that he would, in fact, take a plea deal. He would do 10 years in jail and plead guilty to the murder if he got 10 years instead of 25. And the prosecution didn't take him up on that offer. They essentially told him to go away, which he happily did.
Yeah, and I almost want to say to you, stop talking right there, because you have to listen to the podcast, because all of that is in there. And I think you did it so well to bring all of that information and that side of the story, which really hasn't been heard before by a lot of people, to the fore. I have a comment here from one of the audience members, Alphonse van der Vijver. I am wondering if you are maybe family of Fred. Maybe you can tell us as well in another message. He says, Matthew, the most important thing about the Carolus confession is that it was done to the Stellenbosch police station, which was a different police station to Cluttersville, which investigated the crime. And after the confession was since the confession was after the police had fabricated the fingerprint and told the prosecuting authority, that crossed the point of no return. What do you think of that? And I see
Yes.
Alphonse is Fred's brother.
Right. It was actually, I think, quite disheartening for the Stellenbosch police, because the Serious and Violent Crimes Unit from Cape Town took over this case, and the Stellenbosch police were still looking around for suspects, and they found this man, and he said he was involved, and they got him on camera saying he was involved, and he signed a statement in front of a magistrate. And so they went to the Serious and Violent Crimes Unit and they said, we've done a really good job. You won't believe it, but we've got a guy who says he was involved in the murder. And the guys from the Serious and Violent Crimes Unit said, well, we have Fred's fingerprint on a DVD, so go away. And they that was it. And Stellenbosch kind of went home with their tail between their legs.
And I feel like that is what it was like with all of the evidence. If it fit, it would have been a perfectly open and shut case. But to make it fit, they had to kind of, work with the evidence that they had. And it's there where the mess started, really. The thing that's always kind of baffled me is that Fred had an alibi. He was at work and he had a lot of people at work who saw him there and who vouched for him and said that they saw him. He was in meetings with some of his colleagues. There are security cameras around the office that shows when he arrived at work and when he left. And somehow the police still fixated on the fact that there was a window in which he could have committed the murder, which seemed highly unlikely. Catherine, I don't know if you want to maybe weigh in on that.
Sure, Alet, I think that was very strange for me, that the case wasn't just, I mean, right from the beginning. Fred had an alibi. He could explain exactly where he was. As his lawyer said in the podcast, killers don't do that. They don't come forward and tell you exactly where they were every second of the day. And the security cameras at Old Mutual where he worked were very good. It had an excellent security system. There were, however, 105 minutes that he was unaccounted for. And the police officers felt that there were flaws in the Old Mutual security system and that Fred could have slipped out. So actually, Matt and I tested that and drove and actually from Old Mutual to Inge Lotz's flat and back again. And we found that it was theoretically possible, but really in practice, the fact of the matter, Fred would have come back to work. He would have been covered in blood. He would have had to change, which would have added more time. He would have been very flustered. Yet nobody at the office noticed any emotional change in him. He didn't appear to be, freaked out or upset or anything. So it was really highly unlikely that he could have done that. And not only that, his colleagues vouched for him. They were convinced that Fred had been at Old Mutual that entire day. So, and some of the colleagues, and maybe Matt can come in here with one of his colleagues that Matt interviewed, Nkosele Mbomvu, who was, I think, a senior colleague to Fred. He spoke about that, and he spoke about the intimidation tactics that the police used when they were interviewed. And Matt can come in at this point, I think, and just expand a bit on that, because I thought that was also really a strategy that one could see was going on, where the state put those witnesses on their list. And I think Matt can expand on that as well.
Yeah, in one way, I can almost understand the investigating officers wanting to put some pressure on people who would give Fred an alibi, because they've got all this physical evidence, and maybe not all the policemen knew the problems with the physical evidence. So when Fred's colleague says, well, he was sitting next to me, you maybe as a policeman, you go, well, that just can't be right. His fingerprints on the DVD. So you might get a little bit frustrated. But it seemed to go overboard in this case. And in fact, one of Fred's colleagues, Mr. De Wet van der Spey, testified that he was physically threatened by investigating officers. And they said, if you don't change your testimony, we're gonna hurt you. And he actually went on the stand and testified to that. A pretty brave man. But it seems like there were intimidation techniques. I know certainly Fred was threatened with physical violence on the day he was arrested. So it seemed to be a tactic that the police were using, and I've heard that that's a tactic that gets used quite often. And there must be a line between pressure testing something and actually threatening people.
So one of the last things I want to ask you about is the format of the story and how you told it. You decided to do a podcast, which is a relatively new thing for these type of things in a local context. Catherine, why did you decide to do a podcast, and how did you go about that? Where did you start? I mentioned in the beginning, I think you worked on it for several months. It's not an easy thing to just do overnight. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I've known Matt for many years as an acquaintance, and I'd known while he was working on this story that he was working on it, and I was always fascinated by it because it was a story that I'd wanted to do. and hadn't been able to. So I was always fascinated, and always whenever I ran into anyone who knew Matt, I'd be like, what's happening with that? And then I always remembered him over the years, and I contacted him and said, what's happened? Do you want to go into a co-production with me? And he said, yes, absolutely. So we actually started from the beginning. He took out all the interviews that he had put together and that he had gathered over the years. And we literally started from scratch, you know, transcribing everything, going through everything that he had, and then sitting together, working on a narrative and turning it into a story and something that made sense with the timeline of everything that had happened. But it was just absolutely fascinating and incredible to see the amount of work that he had done over this time that was there and that we were able to sit down and sift through. Was a real honor to work on this project with him.
And why a podcast? Why not a documentary?
I think, you know, podcasts are fairly new, especially in the local context, as you say. I mean, it's far more popular in the States. I think, you know, we decided News 24 has been very interested in developing podcasts, and it's a very interesting way of telling stories. I think in the Inge Lotz story, we had so much that we were able to use everything that Matt had already gathered together and turn it into we were able to use so much sound, and the design was fantastic. I think in this particular series, what I think really adds to it is the video clips. I do think that the bonus features that our audience has access to, I really hope that they take the time to watch those, because those were shot and edited by Matt, and they really do bring the character to life in a more physical way. I think podcasts really take you into the story, and you using your imagination, and it brings it alive through what you're hearing. But the video clips also certainly add to bringing those characters to life for our audience. So I hope that they listen to the podcast and also watch the bonus video clips.
Matthew, it's been 16 years since this murder was committed. What do you want to achieve by telling this story now, so many years after the fact?
That's a good question, and I've had doubts myself, because on the one hand, do you really want to put Inge's family through this again and again and again? And you have to think of their terrible loss. Their lives have been ruined as well. But in the end, for me, it's the fact that I want people to know that sometimes cases are not open and shut, and that there is a lot of room for improvement worldwide, but particularly in South Africa when it comes to evidence gathering, evidence processing, police investigation, and prosecution. And like we were talking about earlier, it leads you to wonder, are there people in South African jails who didn't have access to a good defense, who have been railroaded? And you can't rule that out. And I think that's why this case is important, because of that, and because there are still people out there who think that Fred must have had something to do with it. Where there's smoke, there's fire, something like that. And there's nothing we can do to bring Inge back, but there is something we can do to tell people, actually, this man really is innocent. And that's why I still think that this case is relevant.
Well, thank you for that. And that is unfortunately all we have time for tonight. Thank you to everyone who watched, and thank you in particular to our subscribers. If you are not yet a News 24 subscriber and you haven't been able to listen to this podcast, subscribe. I promise you will not regret it. Until next time, good night.